Fabulous. We are recording and we're ready to go. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited to have with us one of my mentors, my mentor, here to share about community ministry, to speak a little bit about their book, um, and to share with us some ways in which we can navigate this community ministry and provide the best care for those who come seeking care from us. Reverend Dr. Terasa Cooley, hello, hello, hello.
Glad to be with you.
We are just excited to have you with us. We also have our Ebony C. Peace, the director of IMCM, is joining us as well. If I could, I just want to start with Dr. Terasa's bio. How would you like for us to address you during this conversation?
Teresa is fine.
All right, Terasa, perfect. Terasa has been a Unitarian Universalist minister for 35 years, serving in both parish and denominational offices. She grew up in Texas, where she participated in progressive political movements, and then served congregations in Detroit, Chicago, and Hartford, Connecticut. She then worked at various levels at the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, ultimately becoming the vice president of program and strategy. She is now an accredited transitional minister, specializing in serving large congregations that are recovering from clergy abuse. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be with
Yes.
you.
I've got a couple questions for you. I first wanted to bring to light the fact that you are an author, a published author, and you wrote an amazing book, which I had the privilege of perusing, Transforming Conflict, the Blessings of Congregational Turmoil. I want to go ahead, if I can, and share this. Let's see if I can do this. All right. And I want everyone to have the opportunity to not only see a copy of the book, but we're also going to be sharing the link where you can get a copy. And there's a discount. Who doesn't like discounts? All right, so give me a moment. Let me pull this up. And hopefully it comes up. If not, we will find another way. Okay. All right. Yep. And I will come back to that. Ebony, we may need your assistance in this aspect if you're able to share that so everyone can get the opportunity to view it. My computer is not wanting to do so. Okay, so we'll come back to that. I'm going to first start with the question. I just want to know, as I'm new to the UU, I like asking UU ministers about how they got to where they are now, especially for some of us transitioning from a primarily Christian denomination and coming to UU. Can you share the journey that led you to become a UU spiritual leader? And what inspired you to dedicate your life to this path?
Yeah, so as I said in the bio, I grew up in Texas, and you probably know that Texas is a pretty religiously conservative environment. That's the first question anybody asks you, what church do you go to? So my parents became Unitarian Universalists even before I was born. They left the Lutheran Church and founded in Chicago. And so I was actually raised Unitarian Universalist, which is kind of rare. Most of us come out of other traditions. And so for me, having a religious community that reflected the values that were important to me, that were about inclusion and journeying and not stuck with one particular dogma, was so helpful. And so I didn't feel alone, in that larger context. So it gave me a reference. It gave me a place to belong. And then when I was in college, I got really, really active in progressive politics. And at that time, people don't believe it, but at that time, all the top office holders were progressives. And so it was a long time ago, but it was true. That was Ann Richards' time, Jim Hightower. I worked for Jim Hightower. And I just got really frustrated with the whole electoral political process and felt like what we were ending up doing was just trying to reelect people over and over again, not because of what they stood for, but because they were part of our circle or whatever. And so it felt like we were getting further and further away from the goals, which for me, transforming our culture. And so I started to go back to church, and I thought I could maybe do this without having any idea what ministry was.
Mhm.
So got into divinity school only a year after I graduated from college, and been doing it for 35 years. So
That's an amazing amount of time, especially when I think about what I was doing 35 years ago. I was a baby, somewhat. You've been doing it a long time. So when you began the journey, did you foresee that fast forward 35 years, we would still sometimes be struggling with some of the same challenges we'd had 3 decades ago? Could you foresee that, or were you more optimistic?
I don't know that I even really thought about it that much. I mean, I was just interviewed by my college magazine, the alumni magazine, and telling him, and he didn't believe that Texas politics were progressive at that time either, but he wanted me to find pictures of that time, and I found a picture of me and my boyfriend at the time and my best friend doing a reproductive rights march, and I thought, damn, things have not changed. Things have not changed. So yeah, I think I was pretty idealistic at that point, thinking that we could really make a huge difference. And some things have, and we go in cycles. And to me, the cycle is kind of always going generally up, even if it falls back down again at different times. So yeah, I don't know. I really thought that much about the future, but I certainly was hopeful.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes I think of it like priming a pump. Like you got to keep doing this to, and that's what that's what we're trying to do within ministry, and that's what you've been doing for since you received your call.
Mhm.
Um, and you mentioned being a part of a congregation, and I should mention that a congregation that is located in Columbus. And I wanted to ask you, with regard to intersectionality, right? How do you address that? Talking about race, gender, other identities in your advocacy in the past, and even now within your congregation.
So Unitarian Universalists are typically a more white, upper middle class, educated group. And it's been a journey for them and for me to really understand intersectionality and racism in particular. I think we've understood misogyny for a lot longer, but not that much longer, frankly. And so it's a group of people that like to think of themselves as progressive, but don't often have a good experience of analyzing their own behavior. So part of what I have tried to do, first of all, with myself, is teach myself and learn and listen and be in a learning kind of position, like with people like you, who I've already learned a lot from. And to just remember that my perspective is not the only perspective, and I need to step back and really try to help put other people forward. And it's challenging sometimes. It's hard to do that. And so one of my challenges is, as much as I try to encourage a congregation to look at things in a broader way and understand their own actions, if I'm speaking to mostly white audience, what does that do to the people of color who are in the congregation? That makes them feel marginalized, even while I'm trying to get the congregation to get engaged.
Right.
So it's a challenge when you have, a majority and then a smaller group that are trying to break through. And I think people understand, like I said, sexism a lot more than they really understand racism. We've been on a really intense journey, I think, over the last 10 years and have made a lot of improvements, but there's still a long, long way to go. So,
Well, I've witnessed you doing an amazing job, and you have a amazing congregation. And in talking about these intersectionalities, as we were within the
mhm.
U, we were having these conversations about what it means to advocate for marginalized groups, like how hard are we going to go to be able to support those who are different from, right? And
Right.
I remember too that in our, not just in our UU congregations, but Christian as well, there are these conflicts that arise because everyone is standing on a different side. So with regard to your book again, which I was unable to bring up before, I'm going to um
I can put the website in the
oh,
chat.
wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
And then I want to go ahead and share a quote that I got from your website, which we are also going to put into the chat, terasacooley.com. We'll make sure that that's in there for you. Let me go ahead and put it now, actually. This is for everybody. Fabulous. And Teresa went ahead and put in the link regarding the book. Again, talking about intersectionality, just on that topic, because that in itself is large enough in our churches. You were quoted as saying, as much as people wish it were not the case, conflict is endemic in congregations. Rather than consider it something which should be managed or resolved, I have been trained in an understanding of conflict, which asserts that it exists because we have something to learn. Conflict, when engaged with in a healthy manner, offers an opportunity for everyone to learn and change together. Can you break that down even more for our small congregations that are navigating conflict, which oftentimes breaks churches apart?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What do you have for us on that?
Absolutely. Well, I think that it's important to start with yourself. So when I preach about something like racism, I tell my story about how I've learned and grown and hopefully changed over the years as a way of inviting people into my story so that it's not me saying, you people should do this.
Mm.
It's really about um, helping them maybe see themselves and maybe encourage them to go in some of those directions. And so it's I think that we get into trouble, and I talk about this a lot in the book, when we're standing on our positions way up high on our ladder of assumptions, and lecturing at people. And a lot of times what people think is most important is the facts, and we can tell people the facts, and I can give you a whole book about the facts as I see them, and that's not going to get through to people. That's in fact going to alienate a lot of people. And instead, if we start talking about our own stories and why we've come to certain positions and what's gotten us there, and find connections around those stories and around our values, most importantly, that when we get connected around, we both care about this, how
Mhm.
can we get to a different place together? Instead of here's what we're going to argue about. So I think that that's one of the big keys for me, is to get people to walk down from their positions into a place of recognizing what they have in common and what are their common values and how can they together work on those common values. I think that's a really really key piece. um, and what I have found before too, in congregations that are socially justice active in social justice arenas, is that they often kind of put themselves in the position of doing for people as opposed to partnering with people. And so really, again, taking your privilege and stepping back and making room for people who have not been a part of the power structure is a huge part of that as well. And I find when I do that, I learn a lot. I learn a whole lot rather than me coming in thinking I'm the expert and I'm going to tell people what to do. So those are two really key pieces, is paying attention to your position and how you can really use that position to invite, um, as well as then really getting into a place where we can connect around our common values so that we can then talk in a way that's civilized about the things that we disagree with.
And I'm wondering, and thank you for that. I'm wondering, it brings me to ponder a little bit more. Your bio had mentioned that you're serving, you've served congregations recovering from clergy abuse. This seems kind of like a jump to a completely different topic, but I'm trying to stay within the realm of like these systems, that things that are commonly happening within our congregations. In chapter 5 of your book, you referenced congregational systems, and that the systems are more powerful than individuals. So we talked about intersectionality, and thank you for sharing your wisdom on that. Could you tell us how these symptoms impact congregations that are transitioning from previous leadership, maybe along the lines of clergy abuse, previous clergy abuse?
Well, it's something that I talk a lot about in other parts of the book, that when people are traumatized, they can't use their brains. They
Mm,
just don't have access to the part of the brain that can do complex thinking,
yeah.
because that part of our brain that gets activated shuts everything down.
Mhm,
And so people in who are constantly traumatized, it doesn't mean that they don't have brains, but it means that there's a constant way of having to calm them down enough so that they can feel like they can actually connect with people and then start to have more complex thoughts about things. And so in a congregational setting where you've had people traumatized by ministers, there is a collective trauma that some people have experienced more in more depth than others. But it means that I have to help hold the whole system in a place of calming down and dealing with anxiety and trying to help create space for people to come into that in a different way than just reacting.
mhm.
And so even though there's some people who are going to be like, let's get moving, let's move forward, I have to deal with the whole system, and the whole system needs to be regulated. And so if you try to move too fast, if you try to not recognize that trauma, then you're not going to be able to make any progress at all. And if you try to go down that road of let's move, then something's going to come back and interrupt that and undermine that.
And how would you, what would be maybe 3 or 4 steps that a new minister thrown into that type of scenario, what would be the first 3 or 4 things that they should do in order to best care for this new congregation?
Well, the four things would be listen, 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 and listen. You know, that it's so hard for ministers, and I teach interim ministers and transitional ministers in all denominations. It's so hard for them not to feel like they're supposed to go in with this toolkit and they're going to drive people through these processes and they're supposed to get something done, and to help them understand that their very first job is to listen and to learn and to help create a space where people feel like they can bring everything that they've experienced into that space. Um, because otherwise, again, you're just not going to make any progress, and you make it about yourself, not them. And we bring all these assumptions about where they are and where they should be that may not be accurate at all. So spending that first at least several months really trying to get to know the congregation, get to a place of listening, and what that does is not just help me learn what's going on with them, it helps them feel honored.
Mm.
It helps them feel like they're seen in a way that they probably haven't felt for a while. And so it's a way of loving the people, by listening and letting them tell their stories and helping me put the pieces together in a way that I can then hopefully further down the line help them move forward.
It is really like shepherding. I mean, we've heard that term used in many denominations, many churches, but when you think of it, it really is like shepherding, like bringing the fold together, but also, being watchful and listening for cues and things like that.
Mhm.
And again, we're going back to this advocacy. I'm bouncing around. I like to keep things interesting,
Mm.
which is not hard to do with you. Um, Back to advocacy. We have women ministers or prospective women ministers that would be listening to this podcast or the recording. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, um, what is the best way? Like, what is the best advice to give to our young people, to our young women that are possibly from marginalized communities that are looking to pursue a path in social justice advocacy? Again, I'm going to highlight the word marginalized, the words marginalized communities, because that's a different, yeah.
Yeah, so when I was a young minister coming in at the age of 24, there weren't that many ministers that were women at the time. I was always the first woman in most of the churches that I served.
Mm,
And I felt this real need to prove myself. And it really helped me to recognize again that it was about listening and learning. And I think that when we come from a marginalized community, we feel defensive and want to prove something. And to some extent you have to do that, of course, and that's perfectly understandable. But it helps disarm people when you pull yourself back from that and really put yourself in a listening and learning position. I remember there was a guy in the Detroit congregation that I served, which was actually one of the more diverse congregations in the UUA. He was this old African American guy, and he said to me, "You know, Reverend, you've got so many chits you can use. You've only got a few that they give you in the beginning, and you need to recognize that you can't use them all." And so, and that was hugely helpful to me. It was like, oh, I used too many of my chits right now. So I need to pull it back and not push people too hard. And so I think that's the challenge, is that of course we want to prove ourselves. Of course we want to show that we do know something. And the best way of helping get there is actually by listening and learning. And I think that's really, really hard when you're the minority and trying to put yourself in that position, but it helps you become a lot more effective in the long run.
well, I'm glad that you mentioned the chips. I use another word, but I can't say it. I guess I only wake up with two of them. That's all I know. And I'm glad you mentioned them, because just thinking in terms of ministry and advocacy, the amount of energy that it takes. Not, I mean, this is a physically impacted, emotionally impacted, mentally impacted career path, right? And we only have but so many chips. How do you make sure that you have one chip left over for yourself? And how do you care for yourself? What do you do with that one chip? And one more, and have there been times, or have there been years that you didn't keep one for yourself, and how did it impact you?
Oh, I would say the first 20 years of my ministry, I did not care for myself, and it impacted me physically and emotionally. It made me kind of brittle.
Mm,
It made it harder for me to listen to people. It made me feel more driven, um, and then you just end up collapsing in a heap. So there were several times when I just ended up, I'm gonna get out of this. I'm gonna stop this because I can't do it anymore. Took a step back, did something different for a little bit, and then I was able to come back in a different way. And then I finally learned, oh my gosh, I could moderate myself, and I could have boundaries, and I could. And it's really in the transitional ministry that I've finally been able to do this. I'm absolutely adamant about taking days off. I hardly ever let myself get drawn into doing anything on my day off. And it's not only for me, it helps the congregation learn boundaries as well. So setting healthy boundaries, I have dogs because that makes me get outside and take walks, even when it's really crappy weather. And then I have somebody loving on me too. So that's wonderful. So having that kind of interaction. I've got lots of friends all over the country that I am very deliberate about spending time with, even if it's just a Zoom call. That just makes a huge, huge difference. And for years, earlier in my ministry, I did spiritual direction. I did 7 years of spiritual direction, which made all the difference for me, because it helped me find a spiritual discipline, find a spiritual path, recognize that it wasn't about me, that it was about God, or however you want to understand that. And that, in addition to lots of therapy, which I think every minister ought to get, every activist ought to get, period, no matter what, even if you think
yes,
you came from a perfect family, I don't care. You still you still
mental
need it.
therapy.
Right, right. So I think those are really, really key pieces. Another piece is kind of understanding myself. And so I'm a big advocate when I teach other transitional ministers is, what is your style? What is it? What is it that gets you riled up? What is it that you do when you're under stress? What
Mhm.
is it that you do? When do you do your best work? You know, understanding the self, and a lot of us don't have that self-assessment skill set yet.
Mhm.
So being able to do that so that we don't feel like we have to be all things to all people. And sometimes it's best to say, you know, I'm not the person that's really good at that. You need to find somebody else that's good at that because it's not me. So having those kind of boundaries as well, I think is super helpful and super important.
That is so powerful. And I think anyone who's listening to this or watching this can they can attest to the fact that they've gone beyond their boundaries because the boundaries were not set. And then in your mentioning therapy, it almost feels like in 2024, since maybe COVID, we've just begun these conversations about ministers receiving care for their mental wellness and it being looked at as a human thing,
Right.
not a spiritual thing, right? Which is sometimes the challenge in some of our denominations. Therapy is powerful. I'm glad that you mentioned spiritual direction as well. Oh my goodness, even for ministers or going through seminary, find yourself a spiritual director to help you to navigate that because there will be many times in your ministry you'll be thinking of hanging up your shoes
Absolutely.
and going to work at Walmart.
Absolutely. It's like, just give me a 9 to 5 job,
I
please.
don't
Just
want
give
to
me a
think,
nine
I
to
want to
five
hand
job.
out
I don't want
stickers.
to think
Yes,
about it. I don't want to think
yes.
about anything. Let me go work in a bookstore. Yeah, yeah.
That's exactly it. I love that. Your website actually mentions that, and this was something I didn't know from you. I found it on the website that you like to bake.
Oh, I do. I do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
talk
something I
about
started just a few years ago, actually. I for years I did a gluten-free and dairy-free diet. And then I accidentally discovered that I can actually tolerate those things again. And so I thought, well, and I always have to have a new project. I always, because if I don't have my own projects, I will work that out with other people, which is not always very helpful. So I decided to start baking. I'm a really good cook, but I had not done much baking at all. And it's a very different skill. It's a very different skill, but it's also very therapeutic because you have to focus on it a lot. I can cook without even thinking, but
that.
baking, you have to focus on every step and be very exact. And it's really wonderful to find ways that you can then feed people, not just physically, but spiritually. So when I started to do this in the Arlington, Virginia congregation, who had also been traumatized badly by a minister, it was amazing. I didn't want to eat the cakes I made. I don't even like cake. So, so I would make these huge layer cakes and bring them to some big event. And people just were amazed and so grateful for that little act, and so it just encouraged me to keep doing it over and over again. And I got really into sourdough bread baking, um and that's another really, really powerful discipline for me that I just love to do. So that's another way I take care of myself. And if I don't have time to bake bread at least once a week, then I'm out of balance.
It sounds like it would be a ritual. I love to cook, but I don't really bake because I need to focus on the very specific measurements and da da da. But for someone who loves that, that's a passion of theirs, I would assume it's almost ritual to a
Yeah,
degree, right?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And there's healing in that. You're doing something that you love to do. So when you may not love cake, I love cake. I'm going to make sure you have my address here, North Carolina. You know I like to eat.
Yep, yep.
But what you're doing is they're taking in that love and that healing to fill those spaces that are void in some way because of the trauma that they're going through. It's like comfort food. That's where we get the term comfort food from.
Absolutely.
Would
Yeah.
you say that you're writing the book? Would you say that that was also a way for you to self-care? Was that cathartic in any way?
Oh, very much so. But I always say that this book was the book that COVID gave me, because I'm the kind of person that has to write when I'm completely devoted to it. I don't know how these people do, wake up in the morning and do an hour a day. That is just not me, not me at all. So that first full summer of COVID, no, the second full summer when we had another setback. I couldn't do anything. So everybody's been wanting me to write this book for ages. I've been doing workshops around conflict for years and years and years, and everybody's like, when are you going to write the book? When are you going to write the book? So I wrote the book,
Yeah.
and I finished it actually in a month, which was just amazing. It was just ready to come out clearly. And it also made me do a lot more research on it. So I wasn't just going on the same information that I'd had for years. I got into much more in-depth research, and that was really fun as well. So yeah, it was very cathartic and really helpful, because I kept thinking, I'm just quoting other people. This isn't me. I'm just quoting other people. But somebody finally said, well, the way you put it all together is you. That is you. So that was really helpful to have that kind of input. And so yeah, it was fun. I was really happy to do it.
When you were doing this research, you said that, you were just basically saying what other people were saying. What were some of the big things you found out that you didn't know before you did the research for the book?
Well, I got a whole lot more into theories of trauma and recovery. And one of the things that really was fascinating to me is I suddenly put it together that all the ways in which we recover from trauma are what congregations do.
Mm-hmm.
So rhythm and silence and music and sitting still are all ways to deal with trauma, and that's what we do in church. And so it just really hit me that a, we're just a trauma machine. We're just
Mm-hmm.
a trauma processing machine,
Mm-hmm.
probably without knowing it. Which is why a lot of people go to church when they're going through challenges. So that was really interesting to me, and learning things like about intergenerational trauma, which I had no idea about. Really fascinating stuff. um, and I got a lot more into research about ministerial misconduct, and just also some of the other things that are in the world, not just about church conflict, but about conflict in general. So I just did a lot more reading around that.
Well, I would like to aspire to writing something one day and doing the research to be able to learn some new things. And I think that being a new minister myself and those coming into ministry, we 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 can't just assume that we know all the things, even from seminary, right? A lot of it has to be lived experience and doing research and the listening that you mentioned before as well. Um, so I'm wondering, we're churching inside the four walls. COVID taught us that the four walls weren't necessary per se to church
Right.
or to even ministry, right? Because we were all locked down. Um, for those that are trying to find ways to pull community in, right? The people outside of the four walls, um, outside of the parish, what do you suggest? What are some, I know this one is not an easy question, I know for a fact, but what are some ideas that you have to help our churches to reach outward and bring people in,
Well, I
expand
did a
their
lot of,
outreach? Yeah.
yeah, when I worked for the UUA, I did a lot of work on this and hopefully helping people shift from, it's not about bringing people in, it's about going out into the community and living your values out loud
Mm.
in a way that then invites people to come in. So oftentimes we think that, just do some advertising and everybody's going to come. No, no, it's not going to happen that way. You have to get out into the world. And, the Methodists have this concept of understanding their congregation, their church, as a mission field.
Mhm.
It's not just the building, it's a mission field. And I would love everybody to understand their ministry as ministering to a mission field. So how am I ministering to people who are not necessarily coming to my church? And that's one of the challenges that I find about transitional ministry. I just don't have time to do a lot of the community work that I used to be able to do, because doing transitional ministry is like doing full-time ministry, plus you have all the transitional stuff you have to do on top of it. But I think if I don't find ways to help people get out into the community, it's a really frustrating process. And that helps in the healing too. It helps I remember I used to work for the writer Tilly Olson, who was an amazing, amazing writer. She's an old communist, and she said, I met with her when I was early in my ministry, and she said, "How's it going?" I said, "Oh, it's just terrible. The churches are fighting all the time, and I don't know what to do about it." And she said, "Well, get them organized around a common project. Make them do something together that gets them out of themselves." And that was just hugely helpful for me to hear. Let's get out of our own heads and out of our own little blah, 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 and push out into the community in a way that makes a difference. So that has always really stuck with me. But I think you got to meet people where they're at. You got to find ways to meet people where they're at. And so a lot of churches now are doing um, like alternative church spaces. So we've been trying to do this in Columbus, have something called expressive worship, which is a different mode. It's not just sitting there and listening to somebody else preach. You're actually involved in different things. There are churches that do pub ministries or coffee shop ministries. They go out into the community and just set up conversation tables. And I'd love to see, and once we get through the worst of the trauma here in Columbus, I think we're going to be able to move out in a different kind of way. But that really helps the healing process.
I know one of the things I found impactful for myself in coming to the church, to your church in Columbus, was that there were so many different groups. My first Sunday was a day where it was sign up,
Oh, yeah,
all the different groups.
right, right. Yeah,
And to see the intention of being inclusive of our LGBTQ plus communities, our BIPOC communities, our elderly congregants. There were so many different things, and there was plenty, plenty more. But it tasked me, and it would task also members of the church to be that drop in the bucket, right? To be part of something. And with that being said, have you found it to be beneficial having these groups within the church, and church leaders also posted up in each of those groups to um, recruit people? I'm using the term recruit because that's what it felt like, kind
yeah,
of like
no, absolutely. I think if
boots on the
there's
ground.
there's a lot of literature around, if people don't find a place within the first 1 or 2 months, then they're not going to come back.
Yeah,
So if they don't find a small group that they can connect with, if they don't have an affinity group that they can connect with, then they're not going to feel like it's their church. So having all those different ways for people to plug in is super, super important. And large churches can do that better in different ways than smaller churches can. But I remember reading once a book about church size theory, and basically it was that every organization has a kind of, what is the word? There is this primary thing about the number 8. So it's the building blocks of community is groups of 8. And if people don't find that group of 8 to connect with, so in a small congregation, you're going to have 20 groups of 8. In a large congregation, you're going to have 150 groups of 8. But you have to think about it in those terms and not just this whole big body of 600 people that we have, and instead think of what are the groups of 8 that people can connect with, and how do we make that possible?
that's fabulous, because it does take that big, large number, which can feel a little hopeless, into something that is quote unquote manageable, right?
Right,
And more intimate as
right,
well. I think
right,
that it would be a lot more impactful having a conversation with one person with 8, and
right.
instead of trying to speak, 1,000 languages type of
Yep,
thing. That's
yep.
fabulous. That's fabulous. Let's see. So I want to ask you about some advice that you would have, okay? For those who are considering a career in this community ministry thing, right? What advice would you offer? You mentioned the listening. It's important to listen, the power of 8, the doing the research to find out the things. But based on your journey and experiences, what general advice would you have to offer? And what are some key lessons that you've learned along the way?
Well, it goes back to that self-care. If you don't have a way to take care of yourself as you're trying, because the needs of the world are vast. They're
Mm,
absolutely vast.
mm.
And if you get consumed by that, I have a friend who just takes on every cause, every injustice, and she like takes it into her body as a personal assault. And I'm like, how do you live like that? You can't possibly live like that. So you have to have boundaries. You have to be really clear about what you can and can't do and what's most important to you. And you can't take it all. And so finding smaller ways to have impact makes your impact bigger, I think, than trying to do everything at once. Um, and then I think the most profound lesson for me was that it's better to be connected to people than it is to be right.
Mm.
I spent a lot of time thinking that it was about convincing people to agree with me.
That's good.
And it
That's a
doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And it got me into trouble and I couldn't understand because clearly I was right. Why didn't everybody understand how right I was? And instead, really focusing on how to connect with people and be with people, which is a big core part of the conflict work that I've done is, again, it's not about your position and convincing everybody of that. And that was a very profound learning for me that I did not do until probably 10 years into my ministry. I wish
that
I
is
could have
so huge.
started with that.
Like it's amazing how much ego is involved in what it is that we do. And it's hard to step outside ourselves, especially if you have some degrees. If I had doctor in my title, I'm not going to lie to you, Teresa. It'd be really hard to convince me I'm wrong. Masters is enough.
Right, right.
I mean, that's some real stuff. But
Well, and I think,
it's a reality, you know. It's just me being human. I'm being honest about that. I know it's got to be hard because
well, and I
people
think
look to you.
right, right. And the challenge is that most of us who are drawn to ministry are drawn to it because we have some strong egos, right? You know, you're not going to want to stand up in front of people and preach if you don't have a strong ego. And so you have to have that ego to get yourself into it and to believe in yourself enough to do it. And then you have to step back from that ego in order to be effective. So it's a real it's a real challenge that the things you were good at that got you there are not the things that are going to help you stay there, if that makes any sense.
Makes tons of sense. And this is where I can see a spiritual director and peers around you would be helpful so they could tap you on the shoulder and be like, step back.
Yep. Yep.
Step back.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
fabulous. I would like to know, is there anything else you would like to share with us today as I hate to say bye, but we'll be talking again in other ways, but is there anything you'd like to leave with us that is just so deep in your spirit that's something that these our new churches need to know, our community churches need to know?
Yeah, I think if I said the word listen one, at least once, I said it 20 times today. And that's really, it's part of what I teach over and over and over again is that if we can really put ourselves in a listening stance and not make it about us and really make it about learning about others, that's the core of ministry to me. And it's something that I really had to learn deeply, but I wish I would have started with a better understanding of that.
Very powerful. We thank you so much for joining us today, Reverend Dr. Terasa Cooley. TerasaCooley.com. Use the website. We'll be putting that in the chat. The name of this powerful and transformative book, Transforming Conflict, The Blessings of Congregational Turmoil. The website, Amazon site will be in the chat. And also, Teresa has also included her publisher site with a discount code. So that will be included in the chat as well, and any posts we post after this presentation. I thank you so much, Teresa. You are an absolute blessing, and I know that you've blessed our listeners today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the blessings you bring. And Ebony, it was so great to meet you. I look
Yes,
forward to a chance to get to know you better. So thank you so much for all the work that y'all do.
thank you, Ebony.
Thank
Another
you.
amazing individual. You all be blessed. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.